If you're going to get better at the craft of composing, it's good to have certain books in your library. I'm going to share 4 types of books that you should own on today's episode. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit episode number 95. My name is David Lane and it is great to be with you once again. So just a few things right up front. This is certainly going to be one of the shorter episodes of the year. Also, if you are following on YouTube, you'll notice already there's no video for this episode. In fact, I don't even have the camera running as I usually do, even to get a promo. There's a few reasons for that. One of them being I'm still trying to kind of like ascertain how much having the video helps with the YouTube audience. Because I have a suspicion thus far, at least just the way I've been doing it, it doesn't help a whole lot unless I have an episode where it really helps to have a visual aid. And this episode isn't one of them. And the second thing is that I wanted to put something together that didn't take a whole lot of time, something that I could get to fairly quickly, because I am in the midst of a 2-week period that has, I just counted before I started recording, 5 work-related things that I don't normally have going on. And so it is a out of bed to going to bed set of work days trying to get everything done. So this is going to be one of the more shorter episodes. But if you are a composer or aspiring to be a composer, I hope that this episode will be for you. And even if you don't call yourself a composer, but you are interested in just improving this side of things, this episode is not that long, and hopefully you'll get value out of this episode as well. So I've been curious who most of my audience is. That's been one of my goals for the year, to find out like what is the average type of person who listens to this podcast. And I found that a large percentage of you, at least a large percentage of those of you who reach out, are self-taught musicians. That doesn't mean that you've never had training, but it means right now you're responsible for your own continued education, and you might be self-taught always. You might be a self-taught beginner. So the 4 books I'm going to share today are all types of books that you would get provided. You wouldn't even have to choose. You would almost certainly get them if you were to major in composition or even minor in composition as an undergrad student at any university or conservatory. I say that as someone who is more than 25 years removed from the last time I was in that situation. But this is still probably a situation where you would get these types of books. But if you're teaching yourself and you want to get better at composing, there's certainly some things you can do. You can listen to a lot of music. You can get out some scores and you can copy them and you can try to see what's going on. But I just want to give you 4 types of books that you can start off with that can make a big difference in your understanding of music, how it works, and how to do it yourself. And one thing I'll say is these are all textbooks, and most of these, not all of them, but most of the ones that I'll recommend, I mean, I'm talking about most, so I'm only talking about 4, at least 3 of the 4 that I'm recommending have workbooks. And I would say if you can get a used textbook, but if at all possible, if you can manage to get a new, clean workbook, that is a way to get even more out of these things. So let's start off with the first type of book, which is a traditional music theory book, specifically one that talks about what we would call traditional harmony. So this would be a book that focuses on what we would call Roman numeral analysis. In other words, it's based on the idea that in a major minor scale, certain types of chords are major, minor, augmented, or diminished. But these books typically do quite a bit more. It's really a general theory textbook. And I've read a few before. I mean, some of the ones that I've read that I don't recommend, there's one by Walter Piston, who's a good composer. And I don't remember the exact name of his book. I don't have it anymore. But I didn't care for it because it's just very archaic. Like, for example, it talks about dominant seventh chords, which that's a commonplace term. If you've had a little bit of music, you've heard that before, and you probably know what I'm talking about. He doesn't use that term. He calls them major minor sevenths because it's a major triad with a minor seventh. And, that just made me kind of question about some of the other things that are in that book. So the book that I recommend first in this category is one that a lot of, at least in my area, a lot of institutions still use. A lot of like people who do AP music theory and a lot of colleges as well. And I can't remember if it's on the 6th or 7th or 8th edition. I own a copy of the 2nd edition, and that is Tonal Harmony with an Introduction to 20th Century Music by Stefan Koska and Dorothy Payne. In academic circles, it's just called the Koska and Payne. But again, this is called Tonal Harmony. And this is a good all-purpose book. So the first few chapters, in fact, the first section is called The Fundamentals. It's part 1, The Fundamentals. And chapter 1 deals with elements of pitch, and, this is the book where you can kind of learn like what that middle C is a C4, an octave above is C5. You can learn about what makes up major scale, major key signatures, minor scale, minor key signatures, intervals, and what it means to have perfect major, minor, augmented, and diminished intervals. So again, it's not for beginners, but it's a nice overview. And then chapter 2 is elements of rhythm. So we get into rhythm, we get into meter, we get into time signatures. And I really love the way that this book explains simple versus compound time signatures. Then you get into an introduction to triads and seventh chords. And then the final chapter of this section is about diatonic chords in major and minor keys. And again, that's just saying that if you're in a major scale, your 1, 4, and 5 tend to be major chords. Your 2, 3, and 6 tend to be minor chords, and so forth. Part 2 of this book talks about diatonic triads, and a very critical chapter 5 for composers, which is Principles of Voice Leading. On my YouTube channel, I recently posted a video that says why practicing from a hymnal will help improve the way you play jazz chords from a lead sheet. I'm sure I gave it a snappier title, but that was basically what the video is about. And a lot of it has to do with smooth voice leading. It's just hymnals are good examples of smooth voice leading for the most part. And this will teach you how to write in that style, which will, of course, help you understand what's going on. Other chapters in this section, it talks about harmonic progression, so how one chord progresses from another, how triads function when they're in the first inversion. Also a section about cadences and phrases, and then a chapter about triads in the second inversion. And then chapters 10 and 11 talk about the types of non-chord tones. So this is when you're now able to analyze a full piece of music and account for every note harmonically, whether it belongs to the chord or whether it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you can now say what kind of chord it is. Part 3 of this book deals with diatonic seventh chords. I won't read every chapter. Part 4 talks about chromaticism. This is where we get into secondary functions like secondary dominants, secondary leading tones, ways of doing modulation, and it also gets into binary and ternary forms. So we start talking about structure. Part 5 is called Chromaticism 2, and this is where we get into mode mixture, augmented sixth chords, the Neapolitan chord, inharmonic spellings and inharmonic modulations, and then further elements of the harmonic vocabulary. And then Part 6 has 2 chapters. Chapter 27 is Tonal Harmony in the late 19th century, where it talks about counterpoint, sequence, shifting keys, treatment of dominant harmony, expanded tonality. And then Chapter 28 is an introduction of 20th century practices. And it's a very, very good overview. In fact, sometimes I recommend just this isolated chapter for those who just want an overview of some things that developed in the 20th century. So it is, if you had to pick one book of the 4 that I'm going to recommend, I would say that this is the one that I would recommend. Again, there's lots of other books out there. Feel free to check out reviews and see which one you like. but I am a big fan of Tonal Harmony with an Introduction to 20th Century Music by Stefan Koska and Dorothy Payne. And I do know that revised versions have gotten more into 21st century's music as well. But I'm old enough. I went to college in the 20th century, so there you go. Speaking of 20th century compositional techniques, I also recommend having a non-traditional type of theory book that focuses on those techniques. So things that don't necessarily talk about Roman numeral analysis, that don't get into classical form, but talk more about, the extended type of harmonies and bitonality and dissonances that you're very likely to want to use in some capacity, even if you're not totally going against all traditions. You're not trying to be a completely experimental composer. It's kind of expected, if you are writing music now and then, that you have some fluency with the techniques that were developed in the 20th century. And again, this book is not out of date because the innovations of the 21st century, the few that we've had so far, have not been in harmonies. I defy you to go find a chord in a piece after 2000 that you couldn't have found between 1900 and 1999. So the book that I really recommend here, and I think this is a great book, it's by the composer and also late professor, Vincent Persichetti. And it's called 20th Century Harmony, Creative Aspects and Practice. It's actually, if you look at the thumbnail for this episode, if you're on a podcast app that supports seeing the thumbnails for each episode, or you check out the thumbnail on YouTube, you'll see that this book was on the top. It's the one that you can see clearly of the stack of books that I'm talking about here. This book is less really theoretical and more than it is a bag of tricks, but really cool tricks. So there is a chapter on intervals and then one on scale materials and then chords by thirds. Then it gets into chords by fourths, added note chords, chords by seconds, polychords, something called compound and mirror harmony, harmonic direction, timing and dynamics, embellishment and transformation, key centers, harmonic synthesis. And it is chock full of two-staff piano illustrations that you probably want to very slowly go to your piano and play through these and hear how they sound. There are a few books like this. I also recommend, as an kind of an alternate, as kind of like a 2A or 2B, a good arranging book. And I don't have them in front of me, but there's one by Dick Grove called Arranging Concepts. I believe that's what it's called, Arranging Concepts Complete. I'm sorry, this is bad podcasting. I didn't look it up. But things that are kind of like a good reference book for when it comes to just creating harmonies and arranging and coming up with things that sound a little bit different. There was also something by Russell Garcia, who's a film composer who wrote mainly in the 1960s, but he also did some big band arranging. That is a good place to find some interesting things. People who've done both like film scoring or concert music and jazz arranging, you get some very good stuff out of that. So my recommendation for this type of book, the one that I have read and loved, is 20th Century Harmony, Creative Aspects and Practice by Vincent Persichetti. And just in case I'm pronouncing that name wrong, and it might be Persichetti, that last name is Persichetti. The third type of book that I recommend is an orchestration book, an orchestration textbook. And there are so many out there, and the one I'm going to recommend is not the one that is most recommended. And that would be the book by Samuel Adler called The Study of Orchestration. I actually have the workbook for that. I do not have the textbook. It is a very expensive book, and I've been told by many who have read it that it is quite worth it. But that is not the book I have. I have read a couple of books on orchestration other than that one, but the one that I like best is, I don't know if it's still around, I own the 4th edition, and it's called The Technique of Orchestration by Kent Keenan and Donald Grantham. And this book, it does a great job. There's a chapter for the strings, the string orchestra, bowing and special effects. You have an introduction to the woodwinds, the woodwind section, You have a special chapter for the French horn, and then you have a chapter for the trumpet, trombone, and tuba, and then you have a chapter on the brass section. And then there is a chapter called Scoring Chords for each section and for the orchestra. Chapter 11 talks about the problems with transcribing piano music. Chapter 12, Scoring for woodwinds, horns, and strings. Chapter 13 and 14 talk about the percussion. So 13 is instruments of definite pitch. 14, instruments of indefinite pitch. You have a chapter for the harp, celesta, and piano. A chapter for scoring for full orchestra. Chapter 17 is special devices. Chapter 18, infrequently used instruments. This is very helpful. Chapter 19, scoring for high school orchestra. Chapter 20, writing the score and the parts. And then 21, non-orchestral instrumental groups. And then there's an appendix, a list of international names for instruments and orchestral terms. There's a great appendix. Appendix B is the ranges of your instrument. And there are plenty of listening examples for everything they talk about. And I especially love it when it talks about each section. When it talks about like the woodwind section and the brass section, it's the types of sounds you can get in the various ways that you can assign notes of the chord to an instrument. Like, just for a very brief example, if you have 2 oboes and 2 flutes, it's going to be a very different sound if you go from bottom to top, oboe, flute, compared to maybe flute, oboe, flute. Very different effect that you get from that. And, this book does a great job of explaining that. And a lot of very different examples that you can study. And it is also a book with a workbook that I highly recommend. So that brings me to the final type of book that I would recommend that for all composers to have. And this is a book on counterpoint. So counterpoint is the study of how one note works against another note. It's not quite the same as harmony, but it's related to harmony. But it's what you have to have a mastery of or an understanding of in order to write multiple melodies at one time, or a melody and a counter melody. So now the author of the Orchestration Book, the first author I just mentioned, Kent Keenan, he has a book on counterpoint that is excellent for Baroque counterpoint. But the one that I most recommend that I've read, again, that's the disclaimer for all these. I haven't been employed by anybody to read dozens to hundreds of books and come up with, an opinion on this. That would be a great gig to have, because I love to read and I love to give my opinion on what I've read. But this is just things that these have worked for me. And if you don't have something in mind that you're already looking for, you might want to give it some consideration. So the book that I recommend is called Modal and Tonal Counterpoint from Josquin de Stravinsky, and it's by Harold Owen. And pretty much it is what the title says. It goes from the Renaissance era, Josquin de Pré, through composers like Hindemith, Bartók, and Stravinsky. It talks about the do's and don'ts of each of the eras, from Renaissance to Baroque to classical, Romantic, late Romantic, and of course into the 20th century. It gets into specific types of counterpoint, such as the canon, such as the invention, such as also the fugue. Talks about how to handle 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts, and textures that are greater than 4 parts. So again, that's my recommendation, Modal and Tonal Counterpoint from Josquin de Stravinsky by Harold Owen. And I'm afraid my voice has not quite made it all the way to the end of this episode, but let me quickly recap. I recommend that as a composer, especially if you're self-taught, you need at least 4 types of reference books. You need a general theory book, of which I recommend Tonal Harmony by Stefan Kaska and Dorothy Payne. You need a 20th century or non-traditional type of harmony book, and I recommend 20th Century Harmony by Vincent Persichetti. You need an orchestration book, and I recommend The Technique of Orchestration by Kent Keenan and Donald Grantham. And lastly, I recommend having a counterpoint, and I recommend Modal and Tonal Counterpoint from Josquin de Stravinsky by Harold Owen. Feel free to let me know your favorite books of these types, or if you think there's a crucial type of book that a composer should have that I left out. Feel free to let me know with your own voice by going to speakpipe.com/musician toolkit, or go to davidlanemusic.com and fill out the contact form and just let me know your comments with your recommendations, and I'll be sure to include them on a future episode. So that's going to wrap up today's episode. Please share this with a friend if you got some value out of it and you know someone that could also get some value out of it. If you're on YouTube, please click the like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. So I just want to say thank you to all of you who are new listeners and to those who keep returning. It means so much to get your feedback on all of these episodes, and I really just value getting a time to chat with any of you. So that's going to wrap up today's episode. I'll be back with you again next week, but until then, thank you so much for listening.